Close your eyes, take a slow breath in, and let it go. Tonight we are traveling to a place that most people have never thought of as mysterious. A place that exists in the popular imagination as a land of rolling green hills and horse farms and bourbon distilleries and the soft drawl of voices that carry the long history of the American South in every syllable. A place called Kentucky. But tonight we are not visiting the Kentucky of racetracks and bluegrass music and the familiar postcard images of white fences running alongside fields of impossibly green grass. We are visiting the other Kentucky. The Kentucky that existed before any of those things. Before the first European settler pushed through the Cumberland Gap and stood on the ridge and looked out at the vast forested wilderness below, and felt, for a moment, as though he were the first human being ever to see it. He was not the first. Not by a very long way. The Kentucky that we are visiting tonight is the Kentucky of ancient earthen mounds rising from the forest floor, of stone walls running for miles across mountain ridges with no obvious practical purpose, of caves so vast and so deep that entire river systems flow through their darkness, and people have been entering them for thousands of years, seeking something that the surface world could not provide. The Kentucky of ancient peoples whose names we do not know, whose languages have left no trace, whose buildings have returned to the earth, but whose presence is written into the landscape in ways that we are still learning to read. So let your body settle into wherever you are resting tonight. Let your breathing find its slow and natural rhythm. Let the familiar sounds of your world soften and recede. We have a long journey ahead of us. And Kentucky, as it turns out, has been keeping its secrets for a very long time. The first thing you need to understand about Kentucky is its position in the geography of North America. Kentucky sits in the middle of the eastern half of the continent, in the broad valley between the Appalachian Mountains to the east and the Mississippi River to the west. The Ohio River forms its northern boundary, one of the great rivers of North America, flowing west from the mountains of Pennsylvania to join the Mississippi at the southwestern corner of the state. The Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers drain the southern portions of the state. This position between the mountains and the great river made Kentucky one of the most strategically important landscapes in the interior of the continent for the ancient peoples who inhabited it. The rivers were highways. The Ohio River, in particular, was one of the most traveled waterways in prehistoric North America. Canoes moving up and down its current carried people and goods and ideas between the great civilizations of the East and the vast interior of the continent. At every major bend in the river, at every confluence with a tributary, ancient peoples stopped and camped and built and traded. And Kentucky was right in the middle of all of it. The result is an archaeological record of extraordinary richness, spanning 12,000 years of continuous human presence, from the earliest Paleo-Indian hunters who followed the retreating glaciers southward at the end of the last ice age, through the complex mound-building cultures of the woodland and Mississippian periods, all the way to the historic Cherokee and Shawnee, and other peoples who called this landscape home when the first Europeans arrived. 12,000 years. In 12,000 years, a very great deal can happen, and in Kentucky, it did. the oldest mystery of Kentucky begins in the dark. Mammoth Cave is the longest known cave system in the world, not by a small margin. The explored passages of Mammoth Cave extend for more than 420 miles. The next longest known cave system in the world is less than 200 miles long. Mammoth Cave is, in terms of its documented extent, in a category entirely by itself, and it may be much longer still. New passages are discovered regularly. The cave system almost certainly connects to other nearby cave systems in ways that have not yet been fully mapped. The total extent of the Mammoth Cave system fully explored might be twice what is currently documented, or more. The cave formed over the past 10 million years as slightly acidic water percolated through the limestone of the Pennyroyal Plateau, slowly dissolving the rock and creating passages that range from tight crawlways barely large enough for a human body to vast chambers hundreds of feet wide and 50 feet high, their ceilings lost in darkness above the reach of any light. Through parts of the cave system, underground rivers flow. The Echo River and the River Styx, their names given by early 19th century explorers with a flair for the dramatic, run through the deepest levels of the cave in passages where the ceiling drops to the water's surface. They carry the blind fish and the blind crayfish and the other creatures that have evolved over millions of years in the total. The Ohio River moves slowly in the summer, its surface brown and wide, carrying the runoff of half a continent in its current, moving west toward the Mississippi with the patient certainty of something that has been doing this for a very long time. The banks are wooded, the trees coming to the water's edge in most places, their roots finding purchase in the soft alluvial soil that the river itself deposited there over thousands of years. From a canoe on the Ohio River in late summer, the world is very quiet. The sound of the current, the occasional splash of a fish, the calls of the great blue herons that stand motionless at the water's edge, watching for movement in the shallows with a patience that seems almost geological. The distant sound of a crow. The ancient peoples of Kentucky traveled this river in canoes of their own design, hollowed from single large logs or built from bark and sinew. They moved up and down the Ohio with a facility and a confidence that came from generations of experience on these waters. They knew the currents and the sandbars and the places where the river ran shallow over gravel bars and the places where it deepened suddenly into channels that no pole could reach. They knew this river the way you know the streets of your neighborhood. And on the banks of the Ohio, and on the tributary rivers that flowed into it from the Kentucky side, they built. The most spectacular of all the ancient constructions in Kentucky stands near the town of Miamisburg, close to where the Great Miami River joins the Ohio. But Kentucky itself has monuments of equal mystery and equal grandeur, if less dramatic in their individual scale. The mounds of western Kentucky, along the banks of the Ohio and the Tennessee and the Cumberland, are among the least studied and least known ancient monuments in the eastern United States. Some of them are enormous. The Wycliffe Mounds, near the confluence of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers at the southwestern corner of Kentucky, represent one of the most significant Mississippian culture sites in the region. The Mississippian culture, which flourished between approximately 800 and 1600 C, was the last and in many ways the most architecturally ambitious of the pre-contact indigenous cultures of the eastern United States. The Mississippians built platform mounds, flat-topped earthen structures, sometimes enormous in scale, on which they built temples and the residences of important people, elevating the sacred and the powerful above the ordinary level of the community in the most literal possible way. At Wycliffe, the mounds are arranged in a pattern that was carefully designed to organize the space of the community. A large central platform mound, its flat top bearing the most important structures of the settlement. Smaller mounds arranged around it, their positions reflecting the social hierarchy of the community. A residential area extending outward from the mound complex. The community was occupied for approximately 300 years, from roughly 1100 to 1350 C. In that time, something like 1,000 people lived here at any given moment. They farmed the rich alluvial soil of the river bottom, they fished the Mississippi and the Ohio, they traded with communities up and down the river system, their pottery and their copper ornaments and their other goods moving through the networks of exchange that connected the Mississippian world from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. And then, around 1350 C, the community at Wycliffe was abandoned, as so many of these communities were, across the same broad period. The same drought that had disrupted the Caddo in East Texas, the same climate shift that had emptied the cliff dwellings of Arizona, reached into western Kentucky and disrupted the farming that the Mississippian communities depended on. The people did not disappear. Their descendants are among the historic tribes of the region. But the specific community at Wycliffe, the specific social arrangement that had sustained itself here for 300 years, dissolved, and the mounds remained. Rising from the flat Mississippi River bottomland, their grass-covered forms still visible from the river, still marking the location of something that mattered once, still asking to be understood. The Adena culture is perhaps the least known of the great ancient cultures of Kentucky, and yet it is in some ways the most foundational. The Adena people occupied the central Ohio River Valley, including large portions of Kentucky, from approximately 1000 BC to 200 C. That is a span of 1200 years. In 1200 years, the Roman Empire rose from a small city-state to the dominant power of the Western world and declined again. In 1200 years, the entire history of the United States, from the first European settlements to the present day, would fit with centuries to spare. The Adena were here for 1200 years, and what they left behind, most visibly, are burial mounds. The burial mound tradition of the Adena is distinctive and elaborate. The dead were not simply interred in the ground. They were placed in log-lined tombs within the mounds, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, surrounded by grave goods of considerable variety and sometimes of considerable quality. The Adena grave goods tell the story of a people deeply engaged with the spiritual dimensions of death and what follows it. Copper artifacts, beaten into thin sheets and shaped into geometric forms. Shell beads and pendants from marine species that do not live anywhere near Kentucky, traded up through multiple hands from the Atlantic coast or the Gulf of Mexico. Pipes carved from stone in animal forms, the bowls shaped as birds or turtles, or other creatures of symbolic significance. And the tablets. The Adena tablets are among the most mysterious objects in the entire archaeological record of North America. They are small, flat stones, usually a few inches in a dimension, engraved with geometric designs of extraordinary complexity and precision. The engravings are made with a sharpness and a regularity that suggests they were not decorative in the casual sense. They were made carefully, with a specific purpose in mind. What purpose? The leading interpretation is that the tablets were used for tattooing, that the designs engraved on them were pressed into pigment and then applied to the skin, producing the kind of stamped patterns that would have identified individuals as members of specific clans or groups. But this interpretation, while plausible, is not certain. The tablets might have served other purposes. They might have been records of some kind, the geometric designs encoding information in a way that we no longer know how to read. They might have been sacred objects, the designs themselves carrying spiritual power that made them worth placing with the dead. They might have been all of these things at once. The Adena tablets are, like so much of the ancient Kentucky record, genuinely mysterious objects whose existence is clear but whose meaning remains opaque. They sit in museums engraved with their precise geometric patterns, waiting for someone who knows the language they speak. We have not yet learned that language. To the east, in the mountains where Kentucky meets Virginia and Tennessee, the landscape changes dramatically. The rolling bluegrass country gives way to the rugged ridges and hollows of the Cumberland Plateau, a high tableland of sandstone and shale cut through by river valleys of great beauty. The forest here is mixed hardwood, oak and hickory and tulip poplar, with understories of dogwood and redbud that makes spring in these mountains one of the most beautiful seasons anywhere in North America. And in these mountains, in the rock shelters and overhangs and cliff faces of the Appalachian Escarpment, ancient people left their marks. The rock art of eastern Kentucky is one of the least studied and least known bodies of prehistoric imagery in the United States. It exists in scattered locations across the mountain counties, some sites well documented, others known only to local residents who have been walking these ridges all their lives. Petroglyphs, images carved into the rock surface. Pictographs, images painted onto the rock. Both traditions represented, sometimes at the same site, sometimes separated by miles. The imagery is varied, abstract geometric forms that resist easy interpretation. Human figures, highly simplified, their arms raised or their legs bent in postures that suggest dancing or ceremony. Animal figures, some recognizable as deer or birds or snakes, others ambiguous. And in some places, images that seem to combine human and animal qualities in ways that suggest the kind of shamanic transformation imagery we have seen in other parts of North America. One site in particular, in Powell County in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, has attracted attention from researchers who study prehistoric rock art. The site contains dozens of individual images spread across a long limestone overhang, their pigments faded but still visible in the right light. Among the images are what appear to be human figures in elaborate headdresses, their bodies decorated with lines and patterns that suggest ceremonial dress. Near them, animal forms that seem to be in motion, running or flying or swimming. And connecting some of the figures, lines that might represent paths or connections or relationships between the beings depicted. The site was almost certainly used for ceremony. The overhang would have provided shelter for a group of people. Its position above a small stream gives it the quality of a special place, set apart from the ordinary landscape, defined by its specific character in ways that the open ridgetop or the flat valley floor are not. The ancient Kentuckians who came here came for a purpose. What exactly that purpose was, in its specific details, is something we cannot fully know. But the feeling of purpose is still present in the place. The images are still there, faded and damaged by time and weather, and unfortunately in some cases by human hands, but present. The overhang is still sheltered. The stream is still running below. And in the right light, at the right time of day, the ancient figures on the rock still seem almost to move, still seem almost to communicate something that lives at the edge of our understanding, just beyond the reach of our ability to translate. The limestone landscape of central and south-central Kentucky is riddled with caves. Not just Mammoth Cave, extraordinary as it is, caves everywhere. In the karst topography of the region, where slightly acidic water has dissolved the limestone into an underground world of passages and chambers and sinkholes and springs. The ancient peoples of Kentucky knew these caves the way they knew the rivers and the forests. The caves were part of their landscape, not exceptional features to be approached with trepidation, but familiar elements of the world they inhabited. They went into them for minerals, as we have seen. They went into them for water, the underground streams providing reliable sources in dry seasons. They went into them, almost certainly, for reasons that we can classify as spiritual, the underground world occupying a cosmological position in many indigenous American traditions that is both frightening and sacred. The underworld. The place where the dead went. The place from which life emerged in the creation stories of many traditions. The place whose waters, rising to the surface in springs, carry something of the power of the deep world into the ordinary one. The cave was not simply a hole in the ground to the ancient Kentuckians. It was an entrance to what exactly depended on the specific tradition. But the entrance quality, the sense that the cave was a threshold between the world of the living and something else, was widespread enough to appear in many different cultural contexts across North America. In Mammoth Cave, the evidence of the ancient visitors goes beyond the mineral collection we have already discussed. In some of the more remote passages, researchers have found traces of activities that seem less clearly practical and more clearly ceremonial. Arrangements of objects that seem deliberate rather than accidental. Evidence of fires built not for warmth, in a cave where the temperature is a constant 54 degrees regardless of the season, but perhaps for light and for the sacred quality that fire has in so many human traditions. And there are the cave drawings. In 2006, researchers exploring a remote section of Mammoth Cave discovered charcoal drawings on the cave walls. Human and animal forms made with burned cane or charcoal, in passages that required considerable effort and cave knowledge to reach. The drawings have not been fully documented or dated. The work of studying them is ongoing, but their existence miles from the cave entrance, in passages that required the navigational knowledge that comes from long familiarity with the cave, suggests that the ancient peoples who made them knew Mammoth Cave with an intimacy that implies generations of regular visitation. They were not exploring. They were at home. This was their cave, their underground world. And they marked it, in the darkness where no natural light had ever reached, with the same impulse that drove people to paint on canyon walls in Arizona and in the Pecos River canyons of Texas, the impulse to say, I was here, I thought this, I felt this, I made this mark in the darkness so that something of my presence would remain after I was gone. The marks remain 4,000 years later, still in the darkness, still present, still saying what they have always said. The river towns of early Kentucky, the communities that grew up along the Ohio and the Kentucky and the Green Rivers in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, were built on ground that had been occupied before. Almost everywhere in the bluegrass and the river valleys, the early settlers found signs of previous occupation. Mounds, some still prominent, others already reduced by erosion and the clearing of fields. Earthworks, their shapes visible in the right light. Objects turning up in the newly ploughed soil, flint points and ceramic fragments, and occasionally something more striking, a copper ornament or a carved stone pipe of obvious quality and obvious age. The early settlers were, for the most part, not equipped to understand what they were finding. Some of them were curious. A few made collections and wrote descriptions. The physician Caleb Atwater published an early survey of the earthworks of the Ohio Valley in 1820 that documented many Kentucky sites, though his interpretations were sometimes fantastical by modern standards. Others simply ploughed the mounds under. The agricultural transformation of Kentucky in the 19th century destroyed an incalculable number of archaeological sites. Mounds that had stood for 2,000 years were leveled to make fields. Earthworks whose shapes had been visible from a distance were obliterated by the plough. Objects that might have provided crucial evidence for understanding the ancient cultures of the region were discarded or lost. The loss is permanent and immeasurable. We will never know how much was destroyed. What survived is the fragment, the partial record, the small percentage of the ancient world of Kentucky that escaped the plough and the shovel and the casual indifference of people who did not know or did not care what they were destroying. And from that fragment, archaeologists and historians have been trying to reconstruct a picture of 12,000 years of human life in this landscape. The picture is incomplete. It will always be incomplete, but it is also extraordinary. Even the fragment, even the small percentage that survived, reveals a world of astonishing richness and complexity. A world of people who understood their landscape with an intimacy that we can barely imagine, who built monuments that have lasted 2,000 years, who maintained trade networks that spanned a continent, who decorated their dead with objects of great beauty and obvious symbolic significance, who were, in every way that matters, fully human, fully here, fully alive in this Kentucky landscape for 12,000 years before anyone thought to write about them. The Green River flows through the heart of the Mammoth Cave region, its waters drawing from the springs that discharge from the cave system, carrying the cold, clear water of the underground world into the ordinary rivers of the surface. In the Green River Valley, the ancient peoples of Kentucky found one of the richest environments for human life in the entire region. The river itself provided fish in abundance. The floodplain produced wild plant foods across the seasons. The uplands above the valley offered hunting grounds and the raw materials for tool making, and the caves that opened along the valley walls provided shelter and minerals and the connection to the underground world that we have already discussed. For thousands of years, people lived along the Green River, not just camped there seasonally, lived there, built substantial communities, maintained those communities across generations long enough that the accumulation of their daily lives produced shell middens, those great heaps of discarded shellfish remains, that tell us they were eating mussels from the river in such quantities, year after year, generation after generation, that the discarded shells accumulated into mounds visible in the landscape. The Green River mussels were not just food. They were the raw material for an important trade commodity. The freshwater mussels of Kentucky's rivers produce shells of considerable beauty. Some of them, when polished, have the iridescent quality of mother of pearl, their inner surfaces catching the light in shifting blues and greens and pinks. The ancient peoples of the region used these shells to make ornaments and tools and ceremonial objects, and those objects traveled far from the Green River Valley through the trade networks that connected Kentucky to the rest of the continent. Shell ornaments from Kentucky rivers have been found at archaeological sites in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, carried there by the trade currents that moved along the Ohio River and its tributaries. The specific species represented, identifiable from the fragments of shell, confirm their Green River origin. Kentucky mussel shells in ancient ornaments in the ground of the Ohio River Valley. Evidence of a connection, of a relationship between communities that we can reconstruct only partially, only in outline, from the objects that survived. But the connection was real. The relationship was real. The people who maintained it were real. And the river that made it possible is still flowing, still cold, still clear where it emerges from the cave springs, still carrying in its current the water of the underground world. The same water that the ancient peoples drew from and depended on and perhaps regarded with the reverence that a source of life deserves. The Green River is still green. The springs still flow, and in the flow, something persists of the long human relationship with this water. Something that has not entirely ended. The Cherokee called Kentucky the dark and bloody ground. Not because of the conflicts between European American settlers and native peoples that would make the name famous in the 18th century. The name is older than that. It refers to something in the character of the land itself, a quality that the peoples who knew it best recognized and named and incorporated into their understanding of what Kentucky was. A place where different worlds met. The Appalachian Mountains to the east were a barrier, a boundary between the settled Atlantic coastal world and the vast interior of the continent. The Ohio River to the north was another boundary, and Kentucky, lying between these great natural features, was a threshold place. Neither fully eastern nor fully western, neither mountain nor plain, neither the settled world of the coast nor the open world of the interior. A place between. And in many indigenous American traditions, the places between, the threshold places, the places that belong to neither of two worlds but partake of both, are the most powerful and the most dangerous places on the landscape. Kentucky was a threshold, and perhaps that threshold quality, felt by the peoples who moved through it across thousands of years, contributed to its character as a place of sacred significance. A place where ceremony happened, where the boundaries between the human world and the other world were thinner than they were in more settled, more defined landscapes. The earthworks of Kentucky, spread across the landscape from the river bottoms to the mountain ridges, may be expressions of this threshold quality, attempts to mark, to acknowledge, to engage with the power of a place that the ancient peoples understood as charged with a significance that went beyond the merely practical. They built their earthworks where the power was. And the power was everywhere in Kentucky. The Hopewell culture reached its peak in Ohio and Illinois, but its influence spread far into Kentucky and shaped the ancient landscape of the region in ways that are still being documented. The Hopewell are most famous for their burial practices and their trade networks, the two aspects of their culture that are most visible in the archaeological record. But there was more to them than burial mounds and long-distance trade, though both of those are genuinely extraordinary. The Hopewell built ceremonial landscapes. Their earthwork complexes are not just mounds, they are designed environments, spaces shaped by human hands to create specific experiences, specific journeys through the landscape, specific relationships between the human community and the powers they sought to engage. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, the largest of the Hopewell complexes, cover an area of more than 4 square miles. They consist of a series of geometric enclosures, circles and octagons and parallel walls connected to each other by causeways and opening onto each other in ways that create a processional route through the complex. Moving through the Newark earthworks as they existed in their original form would have been an extraordinary experience, a journey through a landscape deliberately shaped to produce specific effects, to move the visitor from the ordinary world into a space of heightened significance. Kentucky's Hopewell earthworks are less extensive and less well preserved than those of Ohio, but they show the same quality of deliberate design. Near the town of Lexington, in the heart of the bluegrass region, there were once earthwork enclosures whose traces were documented by early surveyors before the agricultural transformation of the region destroyed them. The shapes they described, large circles and paired linear earthworks, are consistent with the Hopewell tradition. Their positions in the landscape, their orientations, the way they related to each other and to the rivers, and the topography around them all suggest that they were part of the same ceremonial landscape tradition that produced the great complexes of Ohio. They are gone now. The bluegrass, with its deep fertile soil and its centuries of agricultural use, has been thoroughly transformed. The earthworks that the early surveyors documented survived, most of them only a few decades before the plough took them. But their former presence is not forgotten. It is recorded in the documents of early surveyors, in the field notes of 19th century antiquarians, in the accounts of settlers who arrived to find these strange shapes in the landscape and asked questions that nobody could answer, and in the soil itself, where sensitive instruments and careful excavation can sometimes still detect the traces of where the earthwork builders dug and piled and shaped the earth that is now flat farmland. The earthworks are gone, but the landscape remembers. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a different kind of ancient mystery has been unfolding for decades. It begins with a question that seems simple but is actually profound. Why are there so many caves in eastern Kentucky, and what happened in them? The answer to the first part of the question is geological. The limestone and sandstone and shale of the Cumberland Plateau are riddled with solution features, places where water has dissolved the rock and created underground spaces. The region is karst topography, like the Mammoth Cave area but less extensive, and the caves are numerous, though most are small by comparison with the great cave systems of the west-central part of the state. The answer to the second part of the question is more interesting. The ancient peoples of eastern Kentucky used these smaller mountain caves the way their neighbors to the west used Mammoth Cave, as shelters, as storage facilities, as sources of minerals and water, and as ceremonial spaces. Rock shelters, the shallow overhanging caves that are particularly common in the sandstone country, were used as dwelling sites for thousands of years. The dry protected space under the overhang, with its south-facing orientation and its shelter from rain, provided exactly the kind of comfortable, semi-permanent campsite that the hunter-gatherers of the archaic period preferred. In the rock shelters of eastern Kentucky, the archaeological record is deep. Layers of occupation going back 10 or 12,000 years in some sites, each layer separated from the ones above and below by variations in the soil, the color and texture of which changes with each period of occupation and abandonment. Reading the stratigraphy of a deeply occupied rock shelter is like reading a book in which each page represents a different era of human life in the same space. The people who left the bottom layers were Paleo-Indians, the earliest inhabitants of the region, their presence marked by the distinctive fluted points of the Clovis and Folsom traditions and by the bones of animals that no longer exist. As you move upward through the layers, the material culture changes. New tool types appear. Ceramics appear, then more sophisticated ceramics. The evidence of plant cultivation appears, then the evidence of more intensive agriculture. The whole story of human life in eastern Kentucky, compressed into the accumulated debris of thousands of years of camping in the same sheltered spot. Some of these rock shelters are so rich in archaeological material that they have been the subject of intensive study for decades. Others are known but unstudied, their contents intact, waiting for the resources and the attention that have not yet come. And others, undoubtedly, have not yet been found by modern researchers, though they have been known and perhaps used by local families for generations. The mountains of eastern Kentucky hold more than they have yet given up. More questions than answers, more mystery than resolution. And in that, they are true to the character of Kentucky as a whole, a landscape that has been holding its secrets for a very long time, and is in no hurry to reveal them all at once. The night has deepened around you now. Whatever sounds existed at the edges of your awareness when we began this journey have faded. The world has settled into its nighttime quiet. Your body is heavy and warm. Let the Kentucky landscape settle into your mind like the sediment that the Ohio River lays down on its banks in the spring floods. Gently, gradually, building up in layers. The Paleo-Indian hunters 12,000 years ago, following the retreating ice and the animals it had sheltered, arriving in a Kentucky that was cooler and wetter and wilder than anything we know. The archaic peoples, adapting to the post-Ice Age world with its changed climate and its vanished megafauna, learning to live from the resources of the forest and the river in a way that sustained communities across thousands of years. The woodland peoples, building their mounds and their earthworks and their trade networks, creating a ceremonial landscape that expressed their understanding of a world that was much larger than any individual community, connected to a cosmos that extended in all directions beyond the horizon. The Mississippians, building their platform mounds in the river bottoms, creating communities of thousands in the most fertile landscapes of the region, their civilization flourishing and then contracting as the climate shifted and the old certainties dissolved, and through all of it, the caves. The dark passages of Mammoth Cave, visited for 4,000 years by people carrying their cane torches into the darkness, leaving their footprints in the mud, their tool marks on the mineral formations, their dead in the dry passages where the cave's constant air would preserve what the surface world would have destroyed. All of this is Kentucky. All of this is the landscape that still exists beneath the horse farms and the bourbon distilleries and the bluegrass music and the familiar postcard images. The ancient world is still there, quiet, patient, preserved in part in the soil and the caves and the records that careful researchers have accumulated across generations of study. Still asking to be understood, still offering, to those who come to it with patience and respect, a glimpse of something very old and very human and very Kentucky. Rest in that glimpse now. Let it hold you. As the cave held the ancient miners in its constant temperature and its perfect darkness. As the river holds the water of the underground world in its patient current. As the earth holds everything, always in the end. The ancient astronomy of the mound builders is one of the most fascinating and least known aspects of their culture. The Newark Earthworks of Ohio, which we have already mentioned as the largest of the Hopewell complexes, have been studied extensively for their astronomical properties. The octagon component of the earthworks, a vast enclosure roughly 4,000 feet across, is oriented to align with the northernmost rising of the moon on the horizon. The lunar standstill cycle, that 18.5-year rhythm of the moon's extremes, is encoded in the geometry of the earthworks with a precision that requires sustained astronomical observation across multiple generations. This is not a coincidence. It is not the accidental alignment of a shape that happens to point in a direction that the moon occasionally occupies. It is a deliberate encoding of specific astronomical knowledge in a large-scale earthwork construction. The Hopewell builders of Ohio were serious astronomers, and the Hopewell tradition extended into Kentucky. The earthworks of Kentucky, though less well preserved and less extensively studied than those of Ohio, show the same underlying principles. The same concern with orientation, the same suggestion of astronomical awareness in the alignment of enclosures and the positions of mounds. The ancient peoples of Kentucky watched the sky. On clear nights in the bluegrass, far from any artificial light, the sky would have been as dramatic as any sky in North America. The Milky Way rising above the rolling hills, the planets tracing their slow paths through the constellations, the moon going through its cycle of phases and its longer cycle of extreme positions on the horizon. And the people who watched this sky found patterns in it, found meaning in it, built that meaning into the earthworks and the mounds and the ceremonial landscapes that organized their world. We have lost access to most of that meaning. But the sky itself is still there. On a clear night in rural Kentucky, far from the glow of Louisville or Lexington, the sky is still dark enough to see the Milky Way, still dark enough to see the planets clearly, still dark enough to feel something of what the ancient Kentuckians felt when they looked up at it. That feeling, whatever specific cultural content it carries, is still available, still offered by the sky to anyone who takes the time to look. The Hopewell astronomers looked for centuries, and the sky gave them what it gives anyone who looks at it long enough with genuine attention: the recognition that the world is very large, and very ordered, and very beautiful. The last ancient Kentuckians to leave significant monuments on the landscape before European contact were the Fort Ancient people. The Fort Ancient culture occupied a region centered on the Ohio River Valley in southern Ohio and northern Kentucky. From approximately 1000 to 1650 CE, they were farmers and potters and skilled craftspeople who built villages of considerable size along the river bottomlands. Their most visible legacy is not the forts of their name, which are actually ancient earthworks built by earlier peoples and later occupied by the Fort Ancient culture, but their pottery. Fort Ancient ceramics are among the most varied and most beautiful in the pre-contact archaeological record of the eastern United States. Their vessels show a range of form and decoration that speaks of a rich artistic tradition, of communities that valued beauty in their everyday objects and invested skill and time in creating it. The Fort Ancient people were still in Kentucky when the first European explorers arrived. In 1654, a Virginia colonial expedition under Abraham Wood sent explorers into the Trans-Appalachian West. They may have reached the Ohio River. They may have encountered, directly or indirectly, the peoples of the Kentucky region. By the time more sustained European contact began in the late 17th century, the cultural landscape of Kentucky had changed. The Fort Ancient culture, like many Eastern Native American cultures, had been devastated by epidemic diseases introduced through the expanding networks of European contact. Communities that had sustained themselves for centuries had collapsed. The population of the Ohio River Valley had declined dramatically, and into the depopulated landscape new peoples moved. The Cherokee from the south, the Shawnee from the north, the Iroquois extending their influence westward from their strongholds in what is now New York. Various other groups displaced from their original territories by the pressure of European expansion, moving through and into a Kentucky that was rich in resources but increasingly contested. Kentucky became a hunting ground, a place that multiple peoples claimed the right to use, but none claimed permanently as home territory. The dark and bloody ground, a place between, just as it had always been. The springs of Kentucky are among the most beautiful features of the landscape. They emerge from the limestone at the base of hillsides and along the banks of streams, their water cold and clear even in the hottest summer, their flow constant because it comes from the deep aquifer rather than from surface runoff. Around them, the vegetation is always a little greener, a little more lush than the surrounding landscape. The water-loving plants cluster at the spring margin. The trees grow larger here, their roots reaching the constant moisture. People have been drawn to these springs for as long as people have been in Kentucky. The springs are where the camps were. The springs are where the tools were made and discarded and accumulated in the soil over the centuries. The springs are where life concentrated in the Kentucky landscape, and many of them, the largest and the most reliable, were ceremonially significant. The Blue Hole of Clinton County, a spring-fed pool of extraordinary clarity and depth, was known to the ancient peoples of the region as a place of power. The water rises from a cave system in the limestone below, cold enough to take your breath away even in August. The color, in certain lights, is a deep, clear blue that seems almost artificial in its beauty. Ancient peoples came to the Blue Hole. The evidence is in the soil around it, in the objects found there over the years by farmers and casual collectors, objects that speak of repeated visitation across a very long time. Why here? Because the water is beautiful, and because it is constant, and because it comes from the earth itself in a way that speaks, in the language of ancient cosmologies, of the connection between the surface world and the deep world. The spring is the place where the underground and the above ground meet. The spring is a threshold, and in a landscape defined by its threshold quality, the springs were among the most powerful thresholds of all. You are very close to sleep now. The Kentucky night surrounds you, even from a distance. The crickets calling in the bluegrass, the owls in the oak woods, the sound of the Ohio River moving slowly in the darkness toward the Mississippi. The ancient mounds stand in their fields and their forests, their shapes softened by centuries of weather, their meaning still not fully understood, their builders still not fully known. The caves breathe their constant 54-degree air into the summer night, exhaling the cold underground world into the warm surface one. The springs flow on in the darkness, their water cold and clear and ancient, carrying the dissolved limestone of the aquifer in their current, building up the travertine terraces that generations of water have built up before them. The stone walls run along the ridges in the mountain counties, their purpose still debated, their builders still unknown. All of it is here. All of it is Kentucky. And all of it is asking, quietly, in the language of landscape and time, to be remembered. You have remembered it tonight. You have given it your attention, and in giving it your attention, you have done what the ancient Kentuckians themselves understood as one of the most important things a person could do. You have been present to the place. You have acknowledged its mystery. You have let its long history sit beside you in the dark, not demanding to be fully understood, but simply present, simply part of the world you inhabit for this brief time. That is enough. That is more than enough. Rest now. The mounds are standing in their fields, the caves are breathing in their hills, the rivers are flowing in their beds, and you are lying in the dark, breathing slowly, drifting toward the place where the questions rest and the mysteries hold themselves gently, and the long patience of an ancient landscape receives everything. Sleep. Sleep well. Sleep deep. Kentucky holds its secrets, and the night holds you. The Blue Licks of Robertson County, Kentucky, is one of those places where the ancient and the historical and the natural world converge in a way that makes the ordinary sense of time dissolve. It is a salt lick, a place where brine springs emerge from the ground, their waters carrying dissolved minerals up from the ancient seas that once covered this part of the continent. The salt and the minerals in the water attract animals from miles around, driven by the same instinct that makes all living things seek out what they need. Deer and elk and bison and bear have been coming to Blue Licks for as long as any of these animals have existed in Kentucky. And where the animals came, the hunters followed. The archaeological record at Blue Licks stretches back thousands of years. The ancient peoples of the region knew this place as the animals knew it. They came here not just to hunt, but to use the mineral-rich water themselves for its medicinal properties, for the trace elements their bodies needed, for the specific quality of this water that made it unlike any other water in the region. Blue Licks was a gathering place, a place where the trails of the forest converged and the streams of different traditions of human life in Kentucky met and mixed. The fossils found at Blue Licks in the 18th and early 19th centuries astonished the early naturalists who encountered them. The bones of mastodons and mammoths, enormous and unmistakable, preserved in the mineral-rich soil around the springs. Thomas Jefferson, who had a passionate interest in the natural history of the American interior, received fossil specimens from Blue Licks and corresponded extensively about what they might mean. He believed that the creatures whose bones were found at Blue Licks might still be alive somewhere in the unexplored interior of the continent. The idea that a species could go extinct was not yet fully accepted in Western scientific thought. Surely, somewhere in the vast unknown wilderness of North America, the great beasts still roamed. They did not. The mammoths and mastodons of Blue Licks had been dead for 10,000 years when Jefferson wrote about their bones. But the bones preserved in the mineral soil of the Salt Lick are a reminder that this was not always the world we know. That the ancient peoples who first came to Blue Licks came to a place where the animals they encountered were different from any living today, where the sheer scale of the megafauna made the human presence seem small in a way that we can no longer directly experience. The ancient hunters who stalked mastodons at Blue Licks knew something about scale and about the relationship between human beings and the natural world that we have lost almost entirely. They knew they were not the largest or the most powerful things in the landscape, and they hunted the largest and the most powerful things anyway, with tools made from stone, by hand. That knowledge, that combination of smallness and courage, is one of the most ancient and most human things we know. The Red Bird Petroglyph of Clay County, Kentucky, is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the state's ancient past. It sits on a sandstone outcropping in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, its carved surface facing a small stream valley below. The carving itself is a complex of images, figures and symbols, and what appear to be written characters spread across several square feet of rock face. The figures include what appear to be human forms in ceremonial postures, animal forms that are difficult to identify with certainty, their stylization making them ambiguous between several possible species, and, most intriguingly, a series of marks that some researchers have argued are not pictographic images but actual writing. The claim that the Red Bird Petroglyph contains writing is controversial. Writing, in the conventional archaeological understanding, was independently invented in only a handful of places in human history. Mesopotamia, where the Sumerian cuneiform we have already discussed emerged. Egypt, roughly contemporaneous with Sumer. China, somewhat later. The Maya, in Mesoamerica, independently. And possibly a few other places where the evidence is less clear. North America, in the conventional view, did not have writing before European contact. The complex symbolic systems used by many Native American cultures, including the pictographic traditions we have seen in Kentucky and elsewhere, are considered proto-writing at most. Symbolic communication systems that did not achieve the full phonetic representation of language that defines true writing. The Red Bird Petroglyph challenges this view. Some researchers, studying the marks that appear alongside the more clearly pictographic elements of the carving, have argued that they represent a phonetic script, that they are not just symbols representing objects or ideas, but characters representing sounds, which is the defining characteristic of true writing. If this interpretation is correct, it would fundamentally change the history of writing in North America. The mainstream archaeological response has been skepticism. The marks are ambiguous. Their similarity to known writing systems, which some researchers have noted, could be coincidental. The evidence for a true phonetic script at Red Bird is not strong enough, in the view of most specialists, to overturn the established understanding. But the petroglyph is there. Its marks are carved into the rock, and the question of what they mean has not been definitively answered. The Red Bird Petroglyph is, in the most literal sense, unread. It is speaking, in whatever language it speaks, to anyone who comes to look at it, and we do not yet know what it is saying. The ancient people of Kentucky had a relationship with the dead that was more complex and more sustained than most modern people are comfortable contemplating. The burial mounds we have discussed are the most visible expression of this relationship, but the care and the ceremony that went into those burials, the objects placed with the dead, the construction of elaborate tomb structures, the communal effort invested in building the mounds that covered those tombs, all of this speaks of a belief about the relationship between the living and the dead that went far beyond simple respect for the deceased. The dead, in the understanding of many ancient Kentucky cultures, were not gone. They were elsewhere, in the underworld, in the sky world, in some other dimension of existence that was adjacent to the ordinary world of the living, connected to it, influencing it in ways that required attention and maintenance. The ceremonies performed at the burial mounds were not just funerary rites in the modern sense. They were acts of ongoing relationship maintenance, offerings to the dead, requests for their intercession with the powers of the other world, acknowledgements that the dead retained a presence and an influence in the world of the living. The copper that was placed with the dead at Hopewell burial sites in Kentucky was not simply an expression of the deceased's wealth or status. Copper, in the symbolic systems of many Eastern North American cultures, was associated with the above world, with the sky and the sun and the powers that governed the upper regions of the cosmos. To bury copper with the dead was to equip them for the journey to the sky world and to mark them as people of significance in that world as well as in this one. The mica, that thin, transparent, glittering mineral found in many Hopewell burials, was associated with light and with the shimmer that distinguishes the other world from the ordinary one. To place mica with the dead was to mark their passage into the light of the other world. The bear teeth and the eagle claws and the other animal parts found in Hopewell burials across Kentucky were not trophies in the hunting sense. They were markers of specific spiritual powers, connections to specific animal helpers. The material evidence of relationships that the deceased had maintained with the spirit world during their lifetime, and that would accompany them into the afterlife. Every object in a Hopewell burial tells a story about what the living believed about death and the afterlife, about what they valued and what they feared and what they hoped for, about the specific cosmological framework within which the life and death of this specific person was understood. We can read those stories only partially, but what we can read is remarkable. The ancient Kentuckians thought carefully about death. They prepared for it. They equipped their dead with everything they believed would be needed for the journey ahead. They built monuments to mark the places where the living and the dead continued to meet. They took it seriously. As all people, in all times, have had to take it. As you will have to take it one day, as we all will. But not tonight. Tonight is for rest. Tonight the mounds stand quietly in their fields, and the dead rest in the earth, and the living rest in their beds, and the world turns slowly on its axis under the ancient stars. The forest of Kentucky in autumn is one of the most beautiful landscapes in North America. The oaks turn late, their leaves going from green to bronze to a deep copper that persists on the branches long after other trees have shed theirs. The maples turn early, flaring into red and orange while the oaks are still green, their colour so vivid against the blue October sky that it seems almost theatrical. The tulip poplars go yellow, great spreading trees whose canopy turns to gold in the slant light of the afternoon. And beneath all of it, on the forest floor, a carpet of accumulated leaves that muffles every sound and releases, when disturbed, the complex sweet smell of decomposition, of last year's life becoming next year's soil. The ancient peoples of Kentucky knew this forest in every season. They knew which trees produced mast in which years, the oak and hickory and beech, whose nuts were the most reliable carbohydrate source of the autumn season. They knew which mushrooms were edible and which were dangerous, and where each species was most likely to be found, and in what kind of weather. They knew the medicinal plants of the forest understory, the goldenseal and the black cohosh and the bloodroot, and the dozens of other species whose specific properties had been discovered through generations of careful observation and recorded in the oral traditions of the community. The forest was not wilderness to the ancient Kentuckians. It was a garden. Not a cultivated garden in the sense of cleared and planted fields, though those existed too. A garden in the older sense of a landscape that was known and tended and managed, whose productive capacity was understood and deliberately maintained. The ancient Kentuckians burned the forest, not destructively, deliberately, with the knowledge of what fire does to a forest and how the forest responds to burning. Fire clears the understory. It reduces the accumulated fuel load that leads to catastrophic, uncontrolled burns. It stimulates new growth, the fresh green shoots that deer and other game animals prefer. It maintains the open woodland character of a landscape that, without periodic burning, would close over into dense canopy that reduces the diversity and productivity of the forest floor. The park-like quality of the Kentucky forest that early European observers described, the open woods with their grass-covered floors and their widely spaced mature trees, was not natural in the sense of untouched. It was managed, the result of centuries of deliberate burning by the people who understood that fire was a tool, the most powerful landscape management tool available to a culture without metal implements or draft animals. The forest the early settlers found was a human artifact, a garden tended over centuries by the people who had been here before them. And when those people were displaced, when the burning stopped, the forest changed. The understory closed in. The open woodlands became dense. The character of the landscape shifted in ways that the remaining native peoples, those who had been pushed to the edges of their former territory, could observe and understand. The forest remembered the fire, and in its response to the absence of fire, it demonstrated how much the fire had mattered, how much the human management of the Kentucky landscape had shaped the world that Europeans thought they were discovering for the first time. The rivers of Kentucky are ancient, not in the geological sense that the Grand Canyon is ancient, carved over 5 million years from the deep rock of the Colorado Plateau. The Kentucky rivers are ancient in a different sense. They are ancient in their relationship with the human beings who have lived along them. The Kentucky River itself, flowing northwest from the mountains to join the Ohio at Carrollton, has been a highway for human travel for at least 12,000 years. Its name comes from the Wyandot language, probably meaning land of tomorrow or perhaps meadowland, though the exact derivation is debated. But before the Wyandot, before the Cherokee and the Shawnee, before the Hopewell and the Adena, the river was flowing through this landscape and human beings were traveling it. From its headwaters in the mountains to its mouth on the Ohio, the Kentucky River passes through every major ecological zone of the state. The narrow mountain valleys of the upper reaches, where the river cuts through the sandstone and shale of the Cumberland Plateau. The wider valleys of the middle section, where the river enters the limestone country and the landscape opens out. The broad bottomlands of the lower river, where the floodplain widens and the fertile alluvial soil that attracted agricultural communities spreads out on both sides. Along every section, in every ecological zone, people lived. The river connected them. A community in the mountain headwaters and a community at the river's mouth were in contact through the Kentucky River. Not necessarily direct contact, not necessarily frequent contact, but contact through the chain of communities along the river, each knowing its immediate neighbors, each trading with the people upstream and downstream, the chain of relationships extending the full length of the river and connecting its ends through the intermediate links. The river was a nervous system. Information and goods and people and ideas moved along it at the speed of a canoe in favorable current, and the communities along the river responding to what moved along it were connected to a world larger than any individual community's direct experience. This is the pattern we see everywhere in the ancient world. Rivers as connectors. Rivers as the medium through which the larger civilization maintains itself, even when no single political authority controls the whole river. The Kentucky River connected a world, and that world, though we can only see it in fragments, in the objects that moved along the river and the artistic traditions that spread along it, was real and complex and fully alive. For 12,000 years, along this river, in this Kentucky, the star lore of the ancient Kentucky peoples is almost entirely lost. This is one of the deepest silences in the record of ancient Kentucky, and one of the most poignant, because what little we can infer suggests that the relationship between the mound-building cultures of the Ohio River Valley and the sky was profound and sustained and central to their entire way of understanding the world. We have already discussed the astronomical alignments of the Hopewell Earthworks. The Newark earthworks of Ohio oriented to the lunar standstill cycle with a precision that required generations of sky observation. The earthworks of Kentucky, less well studied but showing similar principles. And there is more. The burial goods of the Hopewell culture, the specific objects placed with the dead, suggest a cosmological system organized around the movements of celestial bodies. The copper associated with the sun and the sky world. The mica associated with the shimmer of the other world. The specific animal species represented in the grave goods, each carrying its own cosmological associations. The shamanic imagery found in Hopewell art, the human figures in bird costumes, the depictions of transformation between human and animal forms is consistent with a tradition in which the shaman could fly, could travel to the sky world, could mediate between the human community and the powers that governed the celestial realm. The sky was not simply above the ancient Kentuckians, it was their other home, the place their dead went, the place the shaman travelled in trance, the place from which the powers that governed life and death, and the seasons and the weather and the fertility of the earth looked down on the human world below. And the earthworks they built were, in part, a response to that sky. A way of marking on the surface of the earth the patterns they had observed in the movements of the celestial bodies. A way of making the landscape below mirror the landscape above. As above, so below. That principle, which would later be expressed in the Hermetic traditions of Europe and the philosophical systems of many cultures, is implicit in the astronomical alignments of the Hopewell Earthworks. The ancient Kentuckians were trying to bring heaven to earth. In the most literal way they knew how, by building its patterns into the landscape they inhabited. The autumn nights of Kentucky are among the clearest of the year. After the humidity of summer has finally broken, after the heat has relented and the air has dried and thinned, the nights of September and October in the Kentucky countryside are extraordinarily transparent. The stars are sharp. The Milky Way is a thick river of light stretching across the sky. The planets are brilliant points that cast, on the brightest nights, the faintest shadows on pale surfaces. The ancient Kentuckians lived in these nights. Without artificial light of any kind beyond their fires, the darkness of a Kentucky night in autumn was complete. Not the partial darkness of a modern rural area where the glow of distant towns colours the horizon in every direction. Complete darkness. The darkness that existed before electricity, before fire, was tamed into reliable sources of artificial light. The darkness of the original world. In that darkness, the sky was everything. The only light, the only reference point, the only clock and compass and calendar and cosmological map available to people who needed all four, and who had learned to read the sky with the patience and the attention that necessity demands. The ancient Kentuckians read the sky. They read it the way the Babylonian astronomers read it, the way the Hopewell earthwork builders encoded it in their geometric constructions, the way every culture that has had to navigate by night and plant by season and predict by observation has always read it, with their whole being, with the accumulated knowledge of generations, with the conviction that what the sky said mattered, that it mattered not just practically as a calendar and a compass, but cosmologically. That the movements of the stars and the moon and the planets were not just physical phenomena, but communications, the ongoing speech of the powers that governed the world, intelligible to those who had learned the language. That language is lost. The specific vocabulary of the ancient Kentucky sky lore, the specific stories told about the constellations and the planets and the Milky Way in the cultural traditions of the Idina and the Hopewell and the Mississippian peoples of this region, is as lost as the languages they spoke. But the sky itself is still there, still speaking, in whatever language it has always spoken. To anyone who takes the time to be still and look up and let the enormity of it settle into them. The ancient stone inscriptions of Kentucky are among the most debated and most mysterious objects in the state's archaeological record. They appear at several locations across the state, carved into limestone and sandstone outcroppings in various parts of the mountain counties and the bluegrass. Some are clearly pictographic, images of animals and human figures and abstract symbols in the tradition we have already discussed. Others are more ambiguous, their marks seeming sometimes like images and sometimes like something else, something more systematic, something that might be a script. The debates about whether any of these inscriptions represent true writing have been contentious. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, a number of researchers and enthusiasts proposed that various ancient inscriptions found in Kentucky and across the eastern United States represented evidence of pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the New. Phoenician sailors, Celtic missionaries, Welsh princes, lost tribes of Israel. The list of proposed ancient visitors to Kentucky grew to remarkable length in the popular literature of the period. The mainstream archaeological response to these claims has been consistently skeptical. And there is good reason for skepticism. The proposed identifications of Kentucky inscriptions as Phoenician or Celtic or Hebrew writing have not withstood careful scholarly scrutiny. The similarities that enthusiasts have pointed to between Kentucky inscriptions and known Old World scripts are not convincing to specialists in those scripts. The supposed translations that some researchers have offered are not credible. But here is the thing. The inscriptions are still there. Whatever they are there. Carved into the rock by human hands at some point in the past. Expressing something that the carver believed was worth the considerable effort of carving it into stone. The mainstream archaeological explanation that the inscriptions are Native American in origin and represent pictographic or proto-writing traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region is almost certainly correct. But within that explanation, the mystery is not resolved. Because we still do not know, in many cases, which specific cultural tradition produced a specific inscription. We do not know when they were made. We do not know what specific message or meaning the carver intended to convey. We do not know whether the inscriptions at different sites are related to each other, part of a single tradition, or whether they represent different traditions from different periods. The inscriptions are speaking. We are still learning to listen. The bones of Kentucky's ancient animals tell stories that go back far beyond any human presence in the region. In the karst landscape of the Mammoth Cave area, the bones of ancient creatures accumulate in the caves and sinkholes in ways that provide an extraordinary record of what lived here across the last 50,000 years. Cave bears, that great European species whose closest North American relative was the black bear, but which was significantly larger and more formidable, ranged through this region during the Pleistocene. Their bones, along with the bones of the short-faced bear, the largest bear that ever lived in North America, have been found in Kentucky cave deposits. The dire wolf, that massively built predator whose dentition suggests it was a bone-crushing specialist rather than a pursuit predator, left its remains in Kentucky cave fills. The American lion, larger than any living lion, stalked the forests and the grasslands of Pleistocene Kentucky. The American cheetah, a high-speed predator whose body plan was similar to the modern cheetah, though not closely related, hunted the open areas. All of these animals were alive in Kentucky when the first human beings arrived. The Paleo-Indian hunters who entered Kentucky 12,000 years ago walked into a landscape populated by predators and prey of a scale that has not existed on this continent since. The hunting was extraordinary, and the danger was real, and the knowledge required to survive in a landscape with American lions and dire wolves and short-faced bears was knowledge of a kind that no human being alive today has had to develop. The first Kentuckians had it. Not by instinct, by culture, by the accumulated knowledge of generations of people who had been living with large predators and large prey animals for a very long time, in other places, before they came to Kentucky. They brought that knowledge with them through the Cumberland Gap, and they used it here to build a life in a landscape that was, by any measure, more dangerous and more abundant and more extraordinary than the Kentucky we know today. That knowledge is gone. The animals that required it are gone. The specific skills and the specific attentiveness that living in proximity to American lions demanded are no longer needed and no longer practiced. But the fact of them was real. The first Kentuckians were capable of things that we are not. And in that capability, there is something worth honoring. The seasons of Kentucky have always been extreme, not in the way of the northern states, where the winters are genuinely Arctic and the summers brief and cool. Kentucky sits in the middle latitudes, its climate moderated by its inland position and its distance from both the northern cold and the southern heat. But the seasons are distinct and they are pronounced. Summer is hot and humid. The moisture from the Gulf of Mexico moving northward and creating the thick, warm air that makes the Kentucky summer feel almost tropical at its peak. The forests are dense and green and full of the sounds of insects and birds. The rivers run warm and low. The springs and the caves offer the only cool that is available without moving to higher ground. Autumn is the relief. The humidity breaks, the temperature drops, the air clears. The trees turn. The nights become cold enough for sleeping under blankets. The days are crystalline and bright. Winter is variable. Some years are mild, the snow brief and the cold manageable. Other years are severe, the Ohio River freezing solid, the temperature dropping to levels that made survival without adequate shelter a genuine challenge, and spring is the redemption. The red bud blooming on the hillsides in late March, its small pink flowers covering the bare branches before the leaves appear. The dogwood following a few weeks later, its white flowers scattered through the forest understory like snow that fell upward. The wildflowers covering the forest floor before the canopy closes over and shades them out. The ancient Kentuckians lived all of these seasons. Without the insulation of modern buildings, without the stored food that grocery stores represent, without the pharmaceutical protections against the respiratory illnesses that winter brings, they lived the seasons directly, in their bodies. And they built their ceremonial lives around the rhythm of those seasons, the ceremonies that marked the transitions, the rituals that acknowledged the turning from summer to autumn, from winter to spring, the gatherings that the abundance of the harvest season made possible, and that the scarcity of winter made necessary. The ceremonial calendar of the ancient Kentucky peoples was the natural calendar of the landscape. The seasons were not just meteorological facts, they were the structure of meaningful time, the rhythm within which human life was embedded and from which it derived its larger meaning. You are very deep in the night now. The seasons have passed through your dreaming mind like the passage of years. The Kentucky forest has turned through all its colors and returned to green. The rivers have risen with the spring floods and fallen back to their summer levels. The caves have breathed their constant air through all the changes of the surface world above them. And you are still here, resting, breathing slowly in the deep quiet of the night. The ancient Kentuckians rested too. After the long days of hunting and farming and building and ceremony, after the sustained attention that a life lived in direct relationship with the natural world demands, after the vigilance that keeping a community safe and fed and intact required, day after day, season after season, year after year. They rested in their log houses and their rock shelters and their cliff dwellings and their mound-side villages. Under the Kentucky stars that blazed above them in the complete darkness of a world without artificial light. They let the day go. They let the work and the worry and the effort release. They breathed slowly in the dark and let the night receive them, as you are letting the night receive you now. You are part of that long line of resting human beings. The latest in an unbroken chain that stretches back 12,000 years in this Kentucky landscape. 12,000 years of people lying down at the end of the day and closing their eyes and letting the darkness carry them somewhere that the waking mind cannot reach. The mounds are standing in their fields. The caves are breathing in their limestone hills. The rivers are moving in their beds. The springs are flowing from the deep aquifer, cold and clear and constant. The stone walls are running along the ridges in the mountain counties, their mystery intact, their builders still unknown, their purpose still debated. And you are resting. In the middle of all that mystery, held by the same earth that has held every sleeping body in Kentucky for 12,000 years, held by the same night that has received every tired person who has ever lain down in this landscape, and let their eyes close, and let their breathing slow, and let the long, dark, patient rest of the ancient world carry them through until morning. Let it carry you now. Let the Kentucky night hold you. Let the ancient landscape receive you. You are safe. You are held. You are part of something very old and very patient and very generous. The mystery will still be here when you wake. The mounds will still be standing. The caves will still be breathing. The rivers will still be flowing. And you will still be here, rested, ready for whatever the morning brings. But that is morning. This is night. And in the night there is only this, the breath coming in, the breath going out, the darkness receiving everything, the ancient Kentucky holding you in its patient, mysterious, 12,000-year-old arms. Sleep, sleep well, sleep deep. Good night, good night, good night.